Hello again, youngins. Now for the continuation of the Witch of Pungo, and probably one of my favorite chapters within the entire series. I'm at what is known as the Narrows, or 64th Street, which is part of First Landing State Park, aka Seashore State Park. This little body of water right there is called the Narrows. It separates, it's a tidal water, flows out to the Chesapeake Bay, and it separates Lincoln Bay, which is here on the southeastern end, from Broad Bay, down that way. It's just a little ways further up. And then beyond Broad Bay, just down the creek called Long Creek, you'll get to the house I grew up in. So this was my backyard for sure. My mother and I fished and crabbed along these waters, and I explored them as a child. And when she got up in years, not long before she passed, she and I had a chance to come down here and do some fishing for some spot and croaker. So it's a very special place for me, and it's also a very special place for many people. You'll see people coming by as I read. First Landing State Park's pretty popular, and right now with everyone social distancing, it's a wonderful place to be. It's steeped with history and culture and I don't know, spirits, I think. When you walk along here, I know that among all this Spanish moss and other things in the maritime forest, that people had lived here for thousands of years, and we're just now coming to terms with how long that really was. But we know that the Chesapeake Indians lived here, and there are signs of their existence all around us. Little bits and pieces like this and this, and rocks like that. And as you walk along the beaches and the shores and areas, you'll look down, you'll see little pieces of existence. They're fragments of pottery made by human hands, anywhere from 400 to thousands of years ago, by a human being that crafted it. You can still see the artistic tool marks within it. You find pieces and chips of stone tools down here. I leave them where they're at, but it's nice to physically touch and hold an item that someone made 100 years ago, 400 years ago, 1,000 years ago, used until it was no longer usable, and then tossed it in what we call a trash pile, but they call it a midden, or we call it a midden. I don't know what they called it actually. But you'll find that here, and the Chesapeake people lived here for thousands of years up until Powhatan wiped them out. An oracle had told Powhatan that a kingdom would arise from the sea, and so he preemptively came across and wiped out the Chesapeake Indians. A short time later, the Virginia Company arrived and set up Jamestown, and they realized that it wasn't the Chesapeakeans after all that they needed to fear. So that's how the story goes, that's how the lore goes. It's full of them. One of my favorites is the story of Blackbeard, the pirate and his treasure. And it's known as fact and lore that Blackbeard sailed his ships into the bay here, into the Broad Bay, and anchored on the high sand dunes to my west. You could put a lookout up in the trees and see out back to Cape Henry, where we were earlier, and see the sails of ships coming to and from the bay. With that, he could board his ship, sail out of Lynnhaven Inlet or whatever body connected at the time, and head off and intervene and apply his piracy on the high seas, and then come back to the safe confines of the bay. And growing up, I always heard tales of the Blackbeard's treasure being buried around here, and I've been looking for it ever since. So that's what today's story is about, and that's what I'm going to read about right now. Maybe you'll get hooked on it as well. Again, great backdrop for growing up. Blackbeard's treasure, that's the Broad Bay Manor, which stood just on the other side of that bay and was clearly visible as a child. Now there's thousands of $1 million homes over there, but used to be just a few estates over there and farms. Blackbeard's treasure. It was late April 1865. Only a few weeks before the news of the surrender of the Confederate Army under General Robert E. Lee had come to Princess Anne County from Appomattox. This has made the family at Broad Bay Manor, the home of Captain Lemuel Cornick, very happy. Now that the war was over, he had written that he could soon come home. The last 4 bitter years had brought sadness to the great plantation on the shores of the Broad Bay. Captain Cornick and his son, John, had fought for the South. John had been killed in the Battle of Seven Pines near Richmond and was buried in Broad Bay Manor Garden. There was no money left, and the slaves owned by the Cornick family had gone to find work elsewhere after receiving their freedom. Old George the gardener and Mammy, the boy's nurse, had asked to stay on with Mrs. Cornick and her young son, Lem. There was only 1 mule left to plow with, and the fields were growing up in scrub pines and honeysuckle. Lem Cornick, hello folks, how are y'all today?
Hey, how you doing?
Good to see you. Lem Cornick had been 10 years old when his father and brother went off to war. His mother had made their uniforms, and they had taken their horses and servants with them. Lem was now 14, and he had become the man of the family. Working hard to help his mother care for the plantation, he had hunted, fished, to provide extra food. He and his hound dog, Frog, spent many hours together in the big woods and on the bay. There were no schools for him to go to, but at night, he and his mother would sit beside the fireplace in the library and study. When the war was over, he hoped that maybe he could go by ship to England to stay with his mother's family and attend Cambridge University if, and a big if somehow the money for the passage across the ocean could be found. On that warm day over 100 years ago, Lem had put his small boat into the water of Broad Bay and with his dog Frog set out for the giant sandhill on the opposite shore. After a short row, he beached his boat and tied it to a tree and climbed the steep side of the tall dune. The sun was warm, the pine straw smelled good, the new green leaves were coming out on the trees, and vines of yellow jasmine added their fragrance to the air. It was good to be alive on such an April day. It is good to be alive on such an April day. At the top of this hill grew a big tulip poplar tree. Lem remembered his father had told him that Blackbeard, the pirate, had had a lookout in a tall tree on top of this hill. This poplar tree was old enough to be that tree. Storms had broken some of its limbs, and all the lower branches were missing. The trunk of the tree was so long around and so smooth he could not climb up into it. He wondered how far he could see if he could get to the top of that tree. He wanted to see from the top so badly that he decided to go home and get some short pieces of wood to make a ladder. Then he could climb to the top and have the same view the pirates had had. It did not take long to get the supplies to build the tree steps, but it took all morning to build the ladder. He would nail a step as high as he could reach, then standing on the step, Lem would nail another, until he climbed high into the tree. To the east stretched the ocean. Toward the north, he could see the rosy sandstone lighthouse at Cape Henry, which guides ships into the Chesapeake Bay. To the south, he could see over the Narrows to Lincoln Bay, and to the west, he saw his own large red brick house surrounded by the plantation land. Now he understood what his father had told him about Blackbeard's lookout. A pirate in the top of this tree could see ships coming toward the Virginia Capes. A signal fire from this hill, trailing smoke into the air, could quickly be observed by the pirates keeping watch on a ship at Lynnhaven Inlet. By the time the English ships entered the Capes, the pirate ship was ready to attack and steal the valuable cargo. Lem's father had told him that Blackbeard was supposed to have buried treasure on the shores of Broad Bay, but no one had ever found any of the 150 years since Blackbeard had been captured and beheaded. As Lem and his dog played on the sand dune that day, the boy thought a lot about Blackbeard. He was happy to share the secret lookout and planned to return soon. Frog slept most of the way home that afternoon, and Lem was tired as he rowed home against the current. It was some time before Lem returned to his lookout tree on the sand dune, for the next day his father came home from the war. Lem would never forget helping his father from his horse, or how he felt that day. Captain Cornick had been wounded in the fighting around Appomattox, and he was a sick man. Mr. Cornick and Lem spent long hours in the sick room, nursing him back to health. As his father got better, Lem followed his father's direction, and with old George's help, planted corn and cultivated the crops needed so much for the family. Letters came from England, but Lem knew there was no need to talk about going to school. A year passed since the day he had built the steps up the tulip poplar tree on top of the great dune. His mother no longer cried when she went about her work, but sang instead. Captain Cornick was well again, and the plantation looked better, with cleared fields and mended fences. The sun was warm, the new leaves were again on the trees, and the air was fragrant with yellow jasmine flowers. Lem and Frog took a day off for a picnic and headed toward the great white hill. They slid on the sand, took a swim in the cold bay, ate their lunch, and finished off with wild strawberries from the woods. Then Lem climbed to the top of the big trees, looked all over the countryside. Far out to sea he saw a large sailing vessel. His thoughts had just begun to travel when suddenly he heard Frog barking furiously in the ravine behind the sand hill. Frog was making the sand fly. He had cornered one of the worst enemies, a big snake. Frog barked and darted quickly to avoid the coiled snake when it struck at him. When his chance did come, he grabbed the snake just behind the head and shook it until it broke the snake's back. Lem hated snakes too, but it was a thrill to watch his brave hound dog kill one. Hello. Hello. Down the tree came Lem, just as Frog finished off a fat cottonmouth water moccasin. The snake continued to move, but it was now harmless. Hello, how are y'all? Frog was panting and exhausted after his battle. Lem praised his dog and petted him while Frog caught his breath. Lem then looked for a stick to pick up the snake, but soon forgot the snake, for sticking out of the side of the embankment of the ravine was a small trunk. It was rusty and cold and old. Could it be the rains had caved in the bank and unearthed Blackbeard's treasure? He tried hard but could not move the chest without a pickaxe and shovel, so he ran to the boat, followed by Frog, and rowed across the bay to tell his father. He found his father fishing off the dock. "Father," he called, "I think I have found Blackbeard's treasure." Captain Cornick said, "Don't get your hopes up. It may be an empty box." He listened attentively to Lem's story of the snake and the dogfight and the discovery of the trunk. Lem begged, "Come, look at it anyway." They went together to get the tools. Captain Cornick and Lem and Frog recrossed the bay and quickly climbed over the dune to the ravine. There was the old rusty chest. As they dug the sand away, Lem's father became more interested than ever. When they found how heavy it was, Captain Cornick said, "By George, I wouldn't be surprised if this isn't some of Blackbeard's loot." It took hard work to get the chest into the boat after sliding it down the sandhill. When they reached home, old George helped them put it in the cart and carry it to the house. A file was used to cut the lock, and everyone gathered around in excitement. Even Frog wagged his tail. The lock came off, but the chest was so rusty it would not open until Captain Cornick hammered at it from all sides. Then the top began to give, and slowly the chest was open. There, safe and sound, after being hidden all those years, was a pile of gold coins flowing from rotted bags. There was enough money to send Lem to England, and plenty to take care of the family in the plantation at Broad Bay Manor. Lem's eyes were wide with wonder, Mother's eyes filled with tears of happiness, and Father just could not believe his eyes. No one spoke for a moment. Then Lem grabbed Frog in his arms. "Good old dog," he said. "You'll miss me when I go to England, and I'll miss you. But if you hadn't killed the snake and dug into the ravine, Blackbeard's treasure would still be hidden." Don't you think that got me out of the house looking? The historical background. Long ago, there were pirates that held up ships and boarded them taking all cargo and money and sometimes killing the crew and passengers by making them walk a plank from the deck of the ship where they would fall into the water and drown. The most famous pirate was Edward Teach, or Blackbeard. He held up ships off the coast of America and in the West Indies when he was operating off Cape Henry. He had a lookout on the hill in Broad Bay. People think he buried his treasure in this area. He was called Blackbeard because he had a long, thick beard which he divided and plaited into sections. People who owned ships hated him, and he was hunted. And a price or reward was offered for his capture. In 1718, he was captured and killed aboard the pirate ship off North Carolina by a brave man named Lieutenant Henry Maynard. Blackbeard's head was cut off and placed on the bowsprit of his ship and brought to Norfolk. It is said that Blackbeard's headless body swam 7 times around the ship and then sank out of sight. Hey, how are y'all today?
Good, how are you doing?
Doing good, thanks. Hey, puppy dog. Hello. All right, so that's it. That's the story of Blackbeard's treasure. A couple mallards flying overhead. And that was probably the single most, biggest reason why I launched off into a lifetime of adventure and searching for Blackbeard's treasure and all kinds of cool stuff, and why I still do it, and why I still come back here all the time. So find your place, at home, near home, far from home. Find your adventures, find your stories, write your own narrative, and tell your own story, but never stop reading other people's. Until next time, I love you guys. Peace.